The prisoner. The crimson towers of the high-flame citadel pierced the toxic clouds of Brandhose Prime like broken teeth against a diseased sky. Deep within its obsidian foundations, in a cell barely wide enough for a coffin, Alice pressed her face against the cold metal wall and tried to remember what Earth smelled like. They called her Prisoner 147A now. Her real name had been stripped away the day they dragged her from the medical transport, along with her freedom, her dignity, and nearly her hope. 3 solar cycles had passed since the Galactic Empire's cleansing ships descended on the outer colonies. 3 cycles since they branded her a traitor for the crime of carrying medicine to refugees. She was 17 Earth years old. The last of her kind. The morning alarm shrieked through the Citadel's corridors, and Alice's stomach clenched. She knew that sound meant entertainment for the nobles. It meant another day in the execution circle, another performance of pain for those who ruled from their glass towers high above. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. The cell door hissed open, and 2 guards in mirror-black armor hauled her to her feet. Her legs, weakened by malnutrition and yesterday's tortures, barely supported her weight. "Time for the show, little earthworm," one of them sneered. They dragged her through endless corridors of polished stone, past viewing galleries where wealthy citizens sipped fire wine and placed bets on how long she would last. The execution circle waited at the Citadel's heart, a vast arena carved from black volcanic glass, its walls rising toward a distant ceiling lost in shadow. And there, suspended in an obsidian cage that hung like a monument above the arena, was Varniker the Endless. Alice had heard whispers about the dragon in the darkness between tortures. 10 stories tall, wings bound by gravity snares, scales blacker than the void between stars. Once he had been the galaxy's most feared creature, devourer of cities, killer of kings, bane of entire fleets. Now he was a trophy, broken by the Empire's power, chained with a collar forged from a collapsed star's core. They said he hadn't moved in years. They said his fire had died with his freedom. The guards shackled Alice's wrists to chains that lifted her arms above her head until her shoulders screamed. Around the arena's balconies, nobles gathered in their shimmering robes, chattering excitedly about the day's entertainment. High above, Varniker's massive form hung motionless in his cage. But as Alice raised her head, fighting through waves of pain, she saw something that made her breath catch. His eyes were open. Molten gold, ancient beyond measure, and looking directly at her. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, human and dragon stared at each other across the vastness of the arena. In his gaze, Alice saw something she thought had been tortured out of her long ago. Recognition. Understanding. The memory of what it meant to be free. And deep in the dragon's chest, for the first time in 200 years, a single ember began to glow. The awakening. The thermal spike drove deep between Alice's shoulder blades, and she bit down hard enough to draw blood rather than give them the scream they wanted. The nobles leaned forward in their seats, disappointed by her silence. "Again," commanded Lord Vex from his golden balcony. "The Emperor pays for spectacle, not stoic martyrs." But Alice no longer heard their voices. Her world had narrowed to the pain, the chains cutting into her wrists, and those ancient golden eyes watching from above. Even as the guard raised the thermal spike for another strike, she kept her gaze locked with Varniker's. She had seen that look before, not in person, but in the old stories her grandmother told. The look of someone who remembered what it meant to protect the innocent. What it meant to care. The spike fell again. This time, Alice's resolve cracked, and a small cry escaped her lips. The crowd cheered, but high above in his obsidian prison, something stirred that had been dormant for centuries. Varniker's wing twitched. It was barely perceptible, just enough to disturb the dust that had gathered on his scales, just enough to make the nearest guard glance up in confusion. But in that tiny movement was the echo of storms that had once reshaped planets. The dragon's memories came flooding back like a breaking dam. He remembered the child on Zirion Prime, caught in the crossfire of an imperial siege. He had been younger then, drunk on his own power, caring for nothing but the hunt. But when he saw that small figure cowering in the ruins, something had changed inside him. He had chosen protection over predation that day. It was the beginning of his war against the Empire. Now, 200 years later, chained and broken in this mockery of a cage, he saw that same innocence in Alice's eyes. The same refusal to let cruelty win, even when it would be so much easier to break. The thermal spike struck a third time, and Alice's head snapped back. Blood ran down her chin, but still she looked up at him. Still she refused to give them what they wanted. In his chest, the ember grew brighter. The pain collar around Varniker's throat began to pulse, sensing the change in his biorhythms. Somewhere in the Citadel's control center, alarms would be sounding. Technicians would be checking readings that shouldn't be possible. But the dragon no longer cared about possible. He closed his eyes and reached deep into the furnace of his soul, to the place where his true fire lived. Not the flames of destruction he had wielded as a weapon, but the deeper fire, the one that burned for justice, for protection, for those who couldn't protect themselves. When he opened his eyes again, they blazed with purpose. Far below, Alice felt the change like electricity in the air. The arena seemed to hold its breath. Even the nobles stopped their chattering, sensing something was different. One of the obsidian bolts securing Varniker's cage developed a hairline crack. On Brandhos Prime, obsidian forged from the planet's molten core was said to be unbreakable. It was the foundation of the Empire's power, the symbol of their eternal dominance. But as Alice smiled through her blood and tears, as she found the strength to meet the dragon's gaze one more time, that crack spread just a little bit wider. The awakening had begun. The breaking point. That night, Alice lay in her cell listening to the Citadel's mechanical breathing, the hum of generators, the whisper of ventilation systems, the distant echo of screams from other floors. But underneath it all, she heard something new. A rhythm. Deep and powerful, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. She pressed her palm against the metal wall. It vibrated with a frequency so low it bypassed her ears and went straight into her bones. Somewhere far above, Varniker was fighting against 2 centuries of captivity, and the very structure of the citadel was beginning to feel it. In the dragon's cage, the pain collar pulsed with increasing desperation. The Empire's technicians had designed it to shut down any hint of rebellion, but they had never encountered one like this. Each pulse of agony only fed Varniker's resolve. He thought of Alice's eyes during the torture. The way she had refused to look away, refused to let them see her spirit break. In 3 solar cycles of captivity, she had maintained something the Empire couldn't touch, hope. The hairline crack in the obsidian grew wider. 3 floors below, in the control center, senior technician Morrow stared at readings that made no sense. The structural integrity sensors are picking up microfractures, he reported to Commander Thane. But that's impossible. These bolts are rated to hold a moon in orbit. Commander Thane, a scarred veteran of the colony wars, felt an old chill run down his spine. When did it start? During today's performance. Right around the time the girl. I don't care about the girl, Thane snapped, but his voice betrayed his unease. What's the dragon's status? Morrow's fingers danced over holographic displays. Biorhythms are elevated but stable. Pain collar is functioning within normal parameters. But sir. He hesitated. The frequency analysis is showing something we've never seen before. What kind of something? He's singing, sir. Subsonic, below the range of human hearing. But the harmonic resonance is affecting the citadel structure. Thane stared up at the ceiling, toward the distant cage where the Empire's greatest trophy hung in chains. Increase the collar's output. Double it. Sir, at those levels. Do it. The pain that lanced through Varniker's body would have killed a lesser being. His massive frame convulsed, wings straining against their bonds. But instead of silencing him, the agony only clarified his purpose. He remembered his true name, not the title the Empire had given him, but the name written in fire and starlight, the name that meant, guardian of the innocent, in the old dragon tongue. His song grew louder. In her cell, Alice felt the change like a symphony building to crescendo. The walls around her vibrated with barely contained power. Hope, real hope, blazed in her chest for the first time since her capture. She closed her eyes and added her voice to his, not audibly, for her throat was too damaged for words, but with every fiber of her being. Two broken souls, bound by suffering, refusing to surrender to the darkness. Above them all, the second obsidian bolt began to crack. Commander Thane burst into the control center as alarms blared throughout the citadel. "What's happening?" "Sir, the cage is destabilizing. If another bolt fails." "How long?" "At this rate of deterioration?" "Maybe hours. Maybe minutes." Thane grabbed the communication array. "All units to the arena level. Prepare the heavy stabilizers. And get me a direct line to the Emperor." But in her cell, Alice was smiling. She could feel it building, 2 centuries of compressed fury and righteous anger, held back by chains that were finally beginning to break. The breaking point was near. The Uprising. The third bolt shattered at dawn. The sound echoed through the citadel like a death knell, a sharp crack that sent nobles scrambling from their towers and guards rushing to emergency stations. In the control center, every display flashed red as structural warnings cascaded across the screens. "Evacuate the upper levels." Commander Thane barked into his communicator. "All non-essential personnel to the escape pods, now." But even as chaos erupted around him, Thane knew it was already too late. The fourth bolt was showing stress fractures, and the fifth was beginning to sing with harmonic resonance. In the arena, Varniker's cage swayed like a pendulum of doom. Each movement sent tremors through the citadel's foundation. The dragon's eyes blazed with power that had been building for 2 centuries, and his subsonic song had become a roar that shook reality itself. Far below, Alice felt the tremors through her cell floor. Guards ran past her door in panic, shouting orders and coordinates. The Empire's perfect order was crumbling, and she was the eye of the storm. She thought of her grandmother's stories, tales of dragons who protected the innocent, who stood against tyranny when no one else would. Tales the Empire had tried to erase, calling them myths and propaganda. But myths didn't crack obsidian cages. The fourth bolt failed with a sound like thunder. Varniker's cage lurched sickeningly, held now by only a single anchor point. The dragon's massive wings, free for the first time in decades, spread partially in the confined space. Dust and debris rained down on the arena below. "Sir." Technician Morrow's voice cracked with terror. "The final bolt is at critical stress. If it goes." "I know what happens if it goes," Thane snarled. He grabbed the emergency communicator. "This is High Flame Citadel requesting immediate reinforcement. Priority Alpha. The dragon is." The communicator died as power fluctuations swept through the building. In his cage, Varniker looked down at the arena where Alice had been tortured. Where she had looked at him with such courage, such refusal to surrender. The pain collar around his throat pulsed desperately, but it might as well have been a child's toy for all the effect it had now. He remembered every innocent life the Empire had taken. Every world they had burned. Every dream they had crushed under their obsidian boots. His fire, contained for 2 centuries, demanded release. The final bolt began to glow with heat stress. "Everyone out!" Thane screamed. "Abandon the citadel. All units, fall back to minimum safe distance." But in her cell, Alice wasn't afraid. She could feel Varniker's rage and pain, yes, but underneath it all was something else, love. Love for the innocent. Love for freedom. Love for everything the Empire had tried to destroy. She closed her eyes and whispered the words her grandmother had taught her, words in the old earth tongue that meant, "Guardian, I trust you." High above, the ancient dragon heard her across the vastness of space and stone and suffering. His heart, cold for so long, blazed with purpose renewed. The last bolt snapped. Varniker the Endless, breaker of chains, guardian of the innocent, fell toward the arena floor with his wings spread wide and fire building in his throat like the birth of a star. The uprising had begun. Freedom's fire. Varniker struck the arena floor with the force of a falling mountain. The obsidian cracked in a perfect spiral around his massive form, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, the entire citadel held its breath. Then he lifted his great head, looked directly at the nearest security camera, and smiled. It was a terrible sight, the smile of an ancient god of fire and storm who had finally remembered his power. The camera feed went dead instantly, but not before transmitting that image across the galaxy, to every Imperial outpost and occupied world. The dragon was free. His first breath shattered every window in the arena. His second brought down half the viewing galleries. By his third, the citadel's upper spires were collapsing in sheets of flame and molten stone. But through it all, his fire never touched the lower levels where the prisoners were kept. Alice felt her cell door buckle and warp from the heat above, but not a single flame reached her. She pressed her face to the twisted metal and called out, "I'm here. I'm here." The response was immediate, not fire, but a sound like music made of warmth and hope. Varniker's voice, no longer the subsonic roar of rage but something infinitely gentler. The sound of a protector calling to the protected. Throughout the citadel's dungeon levels, cell doors began to open. Not burned away, but carefully melted at their hinges with surgical precision. Hundreds of prisoners, political dissidents, war refugees, captured rebels, stumbled into corridors that glowed with golden light. Above them, the Empire's forces regrouped at the citadel's perimeter. Commander Thane screamed orders into his communicator as orbital bombardment ships moved into position. Target the dragon directly. Maximum yield. Bring down the entire structure if you have to. But as the first bombardment lances fired from orbit, Varniker's wings spread to their full magnificent span, 200 meters of scales that had once reflected the light of dying stars. The energy beam struck his wings and scattered like rain, deflected harmlessly into the toxic atmosphere. He was no longer the broken trophy they had chained above their arena. He was Varniker the Endless, and he remembered what that name truly meant. The rescue was methodical, almost gentle. One by one, Varniker found the prisoners and guided them to safety with currents of warm air and walls of protective flame. Alice was among the last he reached, and when she saw him approaching through the smoke and chaos, she wasn't afraid. He was impossibly vast up close, but his golden eyes held the same kindness she had seen from across the arena. When he lowered his great head toward her, she reached out and touched the scales beneath his eye. "Thank you," she whispered. His response rumbled through her bones like distant thunder, "Thank you, little guardian. You reminded me who I was meant to be." By the time Imperial reinforcements arrived, the high-flame citadel was an empty shell of cooling stone. The prisoners had vanished, scattered to safe harbors across the galaxy by methods the Empire couldn't track or follow. And somewhere in the void between stars, a dragon and a girl who had saved each other drifted among ancient trade routes, carrying stories of hope to worlds that had forgotten what freedom looked like. The Empire still ruled from their distant throne, but cracks had appeared in their perfect order. Cracks that spread from world to world, carried by whispered tales of the day a human girl and an ancient dragon remembered that some things were worth fighting for. The rebellion that followed would shake the galaxy for generations. But that's another story. Alice lived to see the Empire fall, 30 years later, surrounded by friends and family on a restored Earth. And on clear nights, when the stars were bright, she would sometimes see a familiar golden gleam moving between the constellations, a guardian still watching, still protecting, still free. The end.